So just once again, thank you for joining us today for this lecture, for the lecture of Professor Toní Pollard. He's the expert in conflict history and archaeology from the University of Glasgow and academic lead of the Waterloo Uncovered project. And last but not the least, a great friend of Ukraine. I'm very excited to hear about this project and his experience, especially how archaeology can work beyond the early modern period. And of course, about the experience working with the veterans and how archaeology can help in supporting psychological recovery. After the lecture, we will have time for questions and discussion. So please feel free to ask anything. So without delaying further, please welcome Professor Toní Pollard.
Thank you, Elisa. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And as Elisa has said, we are great supporters of your academic institutions and Ukraine in general here at the University of Glasgow. And so it's really nice to share some of the highlights, I suppose we could call them, of 10 years of work on the Waterloo battlefield with Waterloo Uncovered. And you'll learn more about Waterloo Uncovered as this talk progresses. But there you will see an average archaeological team on site. I'm in there somewhere, I think at the back with a hat on somewhere. And that crowd includes students, veterans, archaeologists, and historians. And we are stood in front of a very distinctive earthwork, which is known as the Lion Mound or the Butte de Lion. And this is the monument that was constructed by the Dutch on the battlefield after the battle in the 1820s. And it celebrates, or originally celebrated, the role of the Prince of Orange, who was on the senior staff of Wellington's army. And he was wounded in the battle, and his parents, obviously being royalty, thought he deserved some sort of monument for that. So we have this massive cone of earth with a statue of a lion on the top, which is growling towards France to the south. Wellington himself was not very impressed by this monument, and when he last visited the battlefield in 1826, he said words to the effect of, "They have ruined my battlefield." So Wellington clearly had a sense of ownership over the field on which he defeated Napoleon in 1815. And as you will see, there are very few places on the battlefield where you can't see this monument. And I'll also discuss some of the issues of that monument when it comes to understanding the battlefield itself, because it has altered the terrain. Now, I was first invited on this project before it existed by two British Army officers who were in the Coldstream Guards, which was a regiment that fought at Waterloo. And they are Charlie Fournette, who is a still serving colonel in the regiment, and Captain Mark Evans, who left the army after his experiences in Afghanistan, where since when he has lived with PTSD. And their idea was to put together an archaeological project on a conflict site, which would engage veterans and archaeologists. And it had already been proven by Operation Nightingale that veterans working on archaeological project can gain a lot from it with well-being and mental health. And I was very keen to do that. I'd long had the ambition to work with veterans. And so I said yes. And that would have been the summer of 2014. The next year, 2015, was the 200th anniversary of the battle. And so we went out for the first time after getting all of our permissions and putting together our project designs, etc., to basically see whether Waterloo would lend itself to archaeological techniques. And it did. and we are still there 10 years later. So what I'll do is give you a brief tour of some of the things that we've been looking at and some of the conclusions we're starting to draw. So if this works, we should be able to move along. Now, I'm not going to give you a detailed insight into the battle. I did suggest that you might want to look at the Wikipedia entry, and I'm sorry to cite Wikipedia, as we all are, but having gone through all the resources looking for a very simple summary of Waterloo that was in any way accurate, Wikipedia actually came out quite well, but it is quite long. But anyway, without further ado, what we have is Napoleon advancing from the south, having fought both Wellington and his allies, who included the Dutch, the Belgians and the Germans, and another army under Blücher, around 50,000 Prussians. 2 days before Waterloo, they had fought two battles at a place called Ligny and a place called Quatre-Bras. And Napoleon won the Battle of Ligny and pushed the Prussians away. And Wellington, assisting the Dutch, really, managed to hold the French at bay at La Belle-Île, at Quatre-Bras, but had to retreat to the north. And his strategy here was to protect Brussels, which would be the ultimate target of Napoleon and the French, which lies around 10 miles to the north of the Waterloo battlefield. And so what we get is a retreat by the British and their allies, taking up position on a ridge, which Wellington had previously spotted. And there you can see them marked in red on one of many, many battle maps of Waterloo, with Napoleon's army in pursuit. The Prussians had moved away pretty intact to the east, and they were pursued by part of the French army. And Napoleon's plan was to defeat Wellington and his army before he could be joined by the Prussians. And Blücher, the Prussian commander, had promised Wellington that he would be there to help him with the French. And it was a promise that helped decide to make up Wellington's mind to stand and fight. And so essentially what we get is a standoff on the morning of the day of the battle, with the Anglo-Allied army under Wellington on this ridge and Napoleon's French army on a lower line of hills to the south, and the Prussians being pursued by the French, but trying to get their way to the battlefield. And we'll see whether they make that. So we have around 70,000 troops under Wellington. And as I've said, they include Dutch, Belgian, and German troops. The British only make up about a third of that army, but if you hear Brits talking about it, you could be easily misled to believe it was an entirely British army. And we've got Blücher with between 40 and 50,000 troops somewhere to the east trying to hook up. So that gives a total of around 120,000 men. Now, Napoleon by this time has around 73,000 men. So clearly, he does not want those two enemy armies to join up, because his chances defeating that many are obviously less. So what he's trying to do on the day of the battle is beat Wellington before Blücher comes and spoils his plans. Now, Wellington has chosen his battlefield well. He's on high ground. There is a road that runs across the front of his ridge, just in front of the crest, which is a sunken lane with a hedge. And it in effect stands as a ready-made defensive feature. So most of his army is behind that road, behind that trench, and indeed on the backward slope of the ridge. So they can't even be seen by Napoleon's army from the south. And in front of that, on the forward slope, even better, there are 3 farms with high walls, which lend themselves for use as fortified strongpoints. And on Wellington's right, which is on the left of your screen there, you've got Hougoumont, which we will look at again. In the center, we've got La Haye-Sainte, and on Wellington's left, we've got Papelotte. And they are fortified the night before the battle and garrisoned by Wellington's troops, and they will play a key role in the defense of the ridge against Napoleon's assaults. And Wellington is renowned for his defensive tactics, and he's clearly going to stand and fight a defensive battle here, whereas Napoleon is, his reputation is one of aggression in battle, and so he's going to go and attack. And the first place that he does attack in trying to push back or break Wellington's line is the farm of Hougoumont on Wellington's right, which is Napoleon's left, obviously, and it's forward of his main line. And the hope, we believe, because we don't have written orders, we believe that Napoleon here was trying to force Wellington to reinforce the farm to protect his right flank, because he doesn't want to let the French get around his linear position, and therefore weaken the center of his line because he's taken men away. And then after using his cannons en masse to charge, advance up the field and break through Wellington's center. That seems to have been the kind of basic plan here. So the first place to be really assaulted on the day of the battle is Hougoumont, and Wellington's left attacks there. It doesn't quite go to plan for the French. They actually end up putting far more men than Wellington into that battle, and it starts to bleed them dry rather than Wellington. Though there are points in the battle where Napoleon does push at Wellington's line, and at one point late in the day almost breaks through. So we have that assault happening at Hougoumont, but then in the early afternoon at about 1 o'clock, after a heavy bombardment, Napoleon was a artillery officer by training and was well known for his use of his cannon, and he brings a lot of his cannon together into a grand battery of about 80 guns and puts them on a small ridge in front of his main line to the east of La Haye-Sainte, and he from there starts to bombard Wellington's position. But as I've already said, he can't see many of Wellington's men because they're in the dead ground, as we would call it, behind the ridge, waiting for their orders. And in fact, Wellington very sensibly suggests to his men, orders them to lie down, so that they are not, even if cannonballs fly over the ridge, they are not standing there as stationary targets. But that bombardment ceases, and at about 1 o'clock, around 12,000 men under D'Erlon, number 1 Corps of the French army, advances up that ridge between their guns. They pass between the battery and they advance up the hill. Hopefully you can see my cursor. They advance up the hill between La Haye-Sainte and Papelotte in this direction. And they advance in columns, dense concentrations of troops, and they start to make good progress. They push back the front elements of Wellington's army in that position and start to cross that ditch to get to the main position behind it. And it's at that point we see the very famous cavalry charge by Wellington's troops, which push those French troops back down the hill. And they charge all the way down through the guns. They are in no position to do anything with the French guns. They're not prepared for that. They get to the bottom of the hill. They've pushed away the French infantry, but they've got nowhere to go. They are tired. They've lost numbers on the way down. And at that point, the order goes out for the French cavalry, and I've just been discussing or mentioned the Polish lancers, the French cavalry, including Polish lancers, to charge into that disordered group of cavalry, of Wellington's cavalry, somewhere down here, and they cause very severe damage to those troops. It's sometimes said that the British cavalry don't play another role in the battle. They do. They get back up the hill, but that charge is successful in pushing away that infantry advance, but they suffer heavy casualties in doing so. So that in the meantime, Hougoumont is still being assaulted by French troops. La Haye-Sainte, which is defended in the main by German troops, the King's German Legion, is also being assaulted. So we have there almost 2 battles within battles. The next major move by the French is Ney's famous cavalry charge, which goes in at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon across a 1,000-yard gap between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte. And we say charge, but there's been a very wet night before, heavy rain. This is clay soil. These are also fields with wheat and rye in them. And at the time, these crops were very high, much higher than we see them today. And so these horses are churning through muddy soil and also beating down these crops. So they're not charging. This isn't like the scene from the very famous 1970s Bunderchok film, where Waterloo is actually transported to Western Ukraine. One of my ambitions when I do visit Ukraine is to go and visit the set, because they actually built, with the Soviet army occupying at the time, they actually built the battlefield in the landscape, which is phenomenal. But there's a very powerful scene there with the French horses charging up the hill with the helicopters, and you can see the British squares, Wellington squares, and it's not like that. They're going up much slower, and it's much harder than that. But Wellington does put his men into squares so that they can defend every side with the French cavalry milling around them. And attack after attack is put in. This assault under Ney goes on for a couple of hours or so, and they fail to make any headway. At its maximum, we might be looking at around 8,000 mounted French troops involved in that assault, but it fails. Meanwhile, of course, the Prussians, pursued by a French force, are moving in from the east, and late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, they start to appear on the eastern side of the battlefield, approaching Wellington's left flank, which he's deliberately left a little weak because he's hoping the Prussians are going to join up with him. And they arrive, and their corps come in, and they first assault the area around Papelotte. But they also, there's a heavy force comes into the village of Plancenoit, which you can see here, which is actually behind Napoleon's line. And some of the fiercest fighting of the battle takes place in the small streets and the churchyard of Plancenoit. And the village changes hands several times between the French and the Prussians. But for Napoleon, this is big trouble because the Prussians are behind his main line. So he's got two battles to fight now, really, and he has to feed in some of his elite guards, his young guard, into that battle to keep the Prussians at bay. And this obviously gives Wellington hope, and he needs it because around this point, the French do very well. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, they capture La Haye-Sainte. It looks like this is manned by riflemen. They run out of ammunition, and the French storm it. And there's a very brutal hand-to-hand fight. The French take La Haye-Sainte, so this important position in Wellington's centre has fallen. The French then bring up some artillery and put it on a ridge. And if you visit the battlefield today, you can see pretty much exactly where those guns were because the ridge survives. It's next to a sandpit on the other side of the road, which is used for defense during the battle and then as a mass grave after the battle. And at very close range, they start to fire into Wellington squares. And there's one regiment, an Irish regiment here called the Inniskillings, and it's said that they fall in square. There is nowhere you want to be anywhere near, if you're in square, near a cannon, because you're packed together and you can't move. And at that point, it looks like Napoleon might be able to break through, and Ney puts in a request for reinforcements. And my favorite line, basically, from Napoleon of the day is, where do you expect me to get these men? Do you expect me to make them? Because there are no spare. He could have put in some of his guards, but as I've said, he's already committed at Plancenoit. But the next move, and it's really Napoleon's last roll of the dice in the battle, is to bring in his elite troops, his guard regiments, up that same ground that earlier in the day the French cavalry had charged up. So they would be picking their way through dead cavalrymen and dead horses as they make their way to the top. And once they get towards that sunken road at the top of the ridge, they are met with massed musketry from Wellington's guards and other regiments, and it turns them, it breaks them. They're being shot at from at least 2 sides, possibly 3, and there's no way they can break through. So famously, the guards turn back, recoil from that assault, and start to leave the field. And once they start to flee the field, this is Napoleon's elite. The battle is lost, and we get Wellington ordering a general advance off the ridge, and there we have the end of the battle. And I'm not going to go into what happens to Napoleon after. He ends up in a little island in the South Atlantic, but we've got other things to talk about. So that's the battle. Just move this along. Oh, hang on a minute. My slides have decided. There we go. So here we have a lovely Google Earth image of Waterloo today, and you can see, for one thing, it's really quite well preserved. If this battle had been fought in the British Isles in the south of England, it would have been full of housing and industrial estates, etc. But here it's very well preserved, and this is in the southern Belgian state of Wallonia, and they have very good conservation rules. It was until very recently totally illegal, for instance, to do metal detecting on the battlefield. You can now do it, but you need a permit, and the only way you're really going to get a permit is to work on an archaeological project. That doesn't mean to say that we don't have illegal metal detecting, and there have been decades of looting of the battlefield and material taken away. But there you can see some of these sites today. You can see that modern settlement, this is Branolud. To the west, we've got modern development here, but by and large, we're still looking at open fields. So that's where the Lion Mound is. That's La Haye Sainte. There's Hougoumont. There's La Belle Alliance, which was essentially Napoleon's position during the battle. And there's Papelotte over on Wellington's left. And there's Plancenoit. We're not going to talk about Plancenoit, though we have done some archaeology there, and we've got evidence for the fight between the French and the Prussians there. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 sites in the brief time that we have. Hougoumont on Wellington's right, and then behind it, a site I haven't mentioned yet. This is the farm of Mont Saint-Jean. And this is important because it becomes Wellington's main field hospital during the battle. This is where a lot of the wounded were taken to be tended by surgeons. And so it's these 2 sites we're going to look at. First, Hougoumont. And there is a lovely aerial photograph from today. With, as I've said, there are a few places where you can't see the Lion Mound. There's the Lion Mound in the background. And quite close to it, you can see here, this is La Haye Sainte. So you can see there the gap between Hougoumont and La Haye Sainte. So it's through that gap that the French cavalry charged. Now, we might as well talk about it here. What we have with the Lion Mound is a huge brick pillar with the statue on top of it. And to support that pillar, what they've done is they've moved hundreds of tons of earth and mounded it up in this cone, which gives you a fantastic view of the battlefield, but one that was not available at the time, though balloons were sometimes used in battle at this period. And that earth has obviously come from somewhere. So the problem is that what they've done is they've scraped away a lot of Wellington's ridge in that position from kind of his center towards his right, and they've scooped it up and they've piled it, and there are reports of the time of graves being disturbed and bones being heaped up with this soil. So Wellington was right. It has kind of spoilt the battlefield, but of course now it is part of the cultural heritage of the battle, and we regard it with that respect. But even though the battlefield on the face of it is well preserved, the terrain has changed. And one of the important changes is obviously coming quite soon after the battle in the 1820s, when that monument is built. But here we've got what survives of Hougoumont. It still very much has the character of the time, though it was renovated in the 2000s in time for the bicentenary in 2015 by a charity called Project Hougoumont. And in some respects, they've sanitized it. They have covered up evidence for the battle. And as you will see, not everything you see there, which you might think relates to the battle, does. And this is not unusual. This gentrification of battlefields in the decades and centuries afterwards. I won't use the term Disneyfication, but there is something of a theme park about some elements here. But what we've got is we've got a large garden, which is today just a paddock. It's just covered with grass. There is a plan to renovate the garden as it was in 1815. You can't see it because of these trees, but there is a 7 to 8 foot high brick wall running for about 200 meters in this direction and then back there. There is no back wall, but there was a thick hedge, and you've still got some idea of that today. You've got a courtyard here, which at the time of the battle had in its center a large house, a chateau, and you'll see that on plans from the time. That was actually burned down during the battle. It was hit by a howitzer shell and burned to the ground. And a lot of the buildings that were standing around the courtyard, and you can see two of them here, were also burnt out. Not necessarily falling down, but some of them were burnt out and then demolished in the years after the battle. And we've excavated the remains of some of these. The building you can see there with the little turret on it, the little tower, is actually the chapel, which was attached to the big house. And miraculously, obviously, because it's a chapel, it survived the fire. And so it's still standing there as a memorial, and it's quite a moving place, actually. There's a gate into that courtyard, which was actually two when the house was there. There's a south courtyard here and a bigger north courtyard that had buildings around it there. There is a gate in the northern wall, which you can't see there. There's also a gate in the south wall, and there was another gate or small door into the south courtyard here. Now, there is a famous event in the battle, as you will see, when the French get through the North Gate. And the story goes that around 30 French soldiers got inside, but they were all killed and the gates were closed. And Wellington actually said after the battle, it was thanks to the closing of the gates of Hougoumont that turned the battle in our favor. The reality is that the French got through all the gates. These are stories that tend to get subsumed in Anglophile histories of the battle. And we've actually got archaeological evidence that the French got over the wall in this part of the garden and actually were fighting in the garden. And again, this is information really that archaeology has brought to light. But what I want to show you here is these three big chestnut trees in the corner are veterans of the battle. They were standing. There was a wood, as you will see, to the south of the farm, which the French fought through. Fought by the defenders were in the wood, fighting from tree to tree, and then the French advanced and pushed them back behind the walls. The French probably didn't even see the farm until they broke through the wood. But those three trees there are still standing. Unfortunately, the middle one, about 3 years ago, fell down. It was dead. It had been killed by lightning strike, as the one to its right has. We've actually taken samples from it because there are musket balls from the battle actually in the tree trunks of these trees. So quite incredibly, they are last survivors. But also look behind those trees to this. I'm just going to remove that. This strip of ground here. It's around 30 meters across. It's got the south wall of the garden on one side, and on the other would have been the wood. Now, the wood that was here that the French fought through, that I've just mentioned, was so damaged by cannon and musket fire during the battle that it was cut down within 2 years of the battle and given over to agriculture. Hence, we only have a few trees surviving. So the French would have fought their way through the wood, then through a hedge, which is now just this fence line. They've actually replanted this hedge very recently. And then to get to the enemy who were behind this wall, firing through holes they've cut through it and over it, they've got to cross 30 meters of open ground. And after the battle, this area becomes known as the killing ground. And that's because the bodies of French troops were heaped in piles at the base of this wall. And they failed to get through. We have very few written accounts of that action. We think from the scant accounts we have, they put in maybe 3 or 4 attacks across that ground, but are fought back by heavy fire. though we have archaeological evidence that some of them got over that wall, and we'll look at that briefly. So that's the killing ground. That area here to the right of the slide, of course, would have been covered with those trees from the wood in 1815. There was also, we're not going to discuss it here, this field here at the back, this square field, which now usually has potatoes in it, was an orchard, but there's no remains of that. But that was defended as well. So we've got an orchard here with ditches and hedges around it. Then we've got the garden. Then we've got the courtyards here. So we've got several compounds, all of which are fought over independently. And when we're talking, when we're involving veterans, and if they're British veterans, many of them fought in Afghanistan, and they say that working here reminds them of the compounds that they defended or attacked when they were in action in Afghan. So next up, very briefly, this is a famous painting from 1903, which glorifies the British closing of the gates. And there you see redcoats who are actually Coldstream Guards. And my Coldstream Guards colleagues tend to forget that the guys on the right closing the gate are actually the Scots Guards. Now, given I'm in Glasgow, that's obviously important to me. But they tend to only remember the Coldstream Guards, and this is the way that the military works. And in some respects, this is the way that military historians work. They forget some stories and remember others. But when we were excavating the buildings close to this gate, we actually found that had been burnt down. We found burnt buttons from both the Coldstream Guards and the Scots Guards. And these were probably from tunics which were taken off wounded men tended in the building, and unfortunately they may well have been burned to death when these buildings are set on fire late in the battle. But there you have this very famous painting. It's an icon, one of many icons. But here is perhaps a more accurate depiction of Hougoumont. This is the Ferraris map from 1777, when the Netherlands belonged to Austria. And there you can see in red, the two courtyards, and then the walled garden. You can see how ornate it was inside. And these coloured squares and rectangles are actually vegetable patches. Then you've got the orchard next to it. You can see there, that's the chateau, the big building, the big house in the centre. Then you've got the woodland with a track running through it. There's a little chapel here. We've actually excavated the remains of that, but no time for that in this talk. And then at the time, this was what they call an arboretum, which is again a formal garden, but with trees, with paths, and possibly a fountain or a sculpture in the centre. By the time of the battle, this is obviously 1777. By 1815, that has gone and is just open fields of grass and rye with the woodland next to it. So the French are attacking from around 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning of the battle, fighting their way across this open ground and through the woodland. And there is, at that point, part of the orchard, but at the time of the battle, this was just a patch of grass-covered open ground, pretty much as it is today. And that's the scene of the descriptions of piles of dead French. And it became a target, probably quite an obvious target for our earlier parts of the archaeology. And so just to remind you, we're looking at this strip on the right. And there we have another map. Can't have too many historic maps. There's Crane, who is a Belgian cartographer, and this is from 1816. And he's drawn a map where he's tried to integrate the battle. So you have a good idea here. This is a much clearer map. So you can see you've just got an open area for the killing ground. The defenders, Wellington's men, are in red, obviously, and the French in blue. And you've got, at that point, Wellington's troops fighting in the wood, but they are ultimately pushed back behind the walls of the chateau and the garden. And so quite a good map, that, and again gives us context for what we're going to look at in this area here, the killing ground. So when we first visited the battlefield with a very small number of veterans and a very small number of archaeologists, I remember those days very fondly before we started to have hundreds of people, which became a bit too busy for me in my old age. But we were there in Easter of 2015, and it was just after they'd had a massive reenactment of the battle, which I have mixed feelings about. We can maybe talk about that later. But we were there for just a few days to see whether, to do an evaluation really, to see whether there was enough archaeology to merit returning with a full team. And we did some excavation in the garden. And the great thing was that our colleagues at the University of Ghent, this is an international collaboration with AWAP, which is the Belgian Wallonial Cultural Authority. They're great partners in the project. And you'll see some of my friends there in some of these slides, and the University of Ghent, and various other institutions, and obviously the University of Glasgow are all part of Waterloo Uncovered. And the University of Ghent had done some great geophysics, state-of-the-art stuff, which was wonderful, and found a number of anomalies which we investigated. And again, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about them, but they threw up the presence of subterranean archaeology. I hasten to add, none of them were graves. We did actually find the brick kilns that were used to make the bricks to build Hougoumont, which was lovely. But excavation was just one element we were looking at. We also wanted to see whether there was enough buried battlefield material to merit metal detector survey, which is obviously a key tool in what we call battlefield archaeology, which is obviously part of the wider field of conflict archaeology. And so we targeted the killing ground in the belief that there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of musket balls there, fired by the French as they attack in this direction. These two guys here are two detectorists from this direction, and fired from the walls and through the holes in the walls by the defenders. And that first survey, which was just from the surface, and we had a couple of detectorists, and we covered around 100 meters of that strip, that 200-meter strip, and we came up with 3 musket balls. And at that point, we were scratching our heads and almost cancelled the project, because 3 musket balls was not good. And we thought about whether this was due to looters, and we do have an issue with that, or whether there was another factor at play. Fortunately, when we started to look at the geophysical anomalies in this area, we started to scrape off the topsoil very carefully with a mechanical excavator. And once we scraped off a few centimeters, we detected again. And at that point, signals started to come up. And you can see the signals flagged here. Ignore the colors of the flags. They don't mean anything. But each one of those, I'm pretty sure, will be a musket ball. And so we scraped it off again and did the same, and more came up. And so what we discovered was that detecting from the surface gave only a small impression of what was actually present within maybe 30 centimeters of topsoil. We weren't the first people to do this. Andre Schrager at the Lutzen battlefield, 30 Years' War battlefield in Germany, had previously done this, and again found that it resulted in a massive return of archaeological finds. And so there we have that work taking place. And what we did over time was work our way. We'd visit the site for 2 weeks every July, do another strip, come back the next year, do more strips until we joined them all up. So we had a very detailed metal detector survey of the killing ground. And these lovely Chris Collingwood paintings give some impression of that. We've got British guards firing across the wall into the French who have come out of the wood into the killing ground. And then we've got the alternative view from the French assaulting the wall with the soldiers above it firing at them. And one of the interesting things, very useful things about warfare at this time is that we can tell the difference between who's firing what, because as you can see here are 2 musket balls. The one on the left is a Brown Bess. So that's the weapon that most of the Allied troops were using under Wellington. Not all of them. Some of them were using rifles, but the vast majority were using the Brown Bess, as you see here, and it's a .75 caliber, which basically means it's that size. The French, on the other hand, are using a .69 caliber musket, and it's slightly smaller. So it means that even though we're just looking at spheres of lead, we can actually tell which munitions have been fired by which side. And I knew this previously from my work at the Culloden battlefield from 1746 in Scotland, where the technology was exactly the same. Firearms technology had changed very little between 1746 and 1815. So that's very useful for us, and we've been able to plot Wellington's musket shot and Napoleon's musket shot. Now, just a reference to the wall there, it looks well preserved. It's got the holes that the British troops and their allies pushed through the wall the night before the battle. Don't believe any of it. None of that wall was standing in 1815 because we've excavated the base of it. We found the base of the original wall, which for the most part is just in front of that wall and indeed below it. And we've even got musket balls that have hit the wall and they're splattered with red brick dust in them. And if you go back and look at photographs online from the last 50 years, you will see that at times that wall has collapsed in bits along lengths. And you can actually see, if you look carefully there, you see that different color in the bricks. So that section there is later than this section here, and it looks like there's another one there. So the thing is, you've got a 200-meter long brick wall that's 8 foot high. It's going to collapse under its own weight. It's not, it doesn't take much to knock it down. And so it's been rebuilt and rebuilt over time. And these loopholes, which look nothing like they would have done at the time, nor are they in the same places, are now very decorative, and they've got stone lining them. So the unfortunate thing is that people visit and they think they're looking at the original. They are not. This has been knocked down and rebuilt on numerous occasions. So a bit of myth busting there. So what do we end up with? Well, this is a snapshot of the battle after all of that metal detecting. Unfortunately, we can't go any further to the left here because there's a huge scoop where sand has been quarried post-battle, so there's no original ground surface left. But you can see there the scatter of musket shot that we've got after using this process of taking down spits, as we call them, with the excavator and detecting each new surface. And here, for the sake of argument, blue is French and red is Wellington's troops. And you can see there you've got distinct concentrations of shot, French shot against the wall. We've got one in the corner, we've got one here, we've got a longer one here, we've got a possible one here, and a definite one here. And of course, we've got Wellington's men behind the wall firing towards the French. And we think the concentrations here relate to gaps in the hedge that the French were coming through. There's no trace of this hedge now. We found some archaeological traces of it in trenches, but there's no trace of the physical hedge there. And we think these probably correspond to holes in the hedges where the French are breaking through out into the open ground of the killing ground. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to complete this picture by metal detecting here, because every time we go to Waterloo, there are crops in this field. So we haven't yet managed to complete the picture. We would expect to see a lot more of this red shot extending into the field beyond the hedge. So we've got concentrations of fire, which obviously mark intensification of these assaults by the French. But you will also see beyond the wall, we've got red and blue shot in the garden. Now, at first we thought, oh, these are just lead shot that have been fired into the garden and dropped to the ground by the French, or dropped ammunition by the defenders in the inside, which is not unusual. However, our analysis shows that many of these have been fired at close range and hit a target at close range because they're distorted. So they have been fired within the garden. So this is pretty clear evidence that at least some French troops got into the garden over the wall. And there are zero accounts, really. There's one French account from years later that the French got in. One of the British officers whose memories are recorded says the French never got into the garden. Well, they did. Archaeology tells us otherwise. So this is quite an incredible snapshot of one point in the battle, and we're still working through the analysis of the lead shot. We're trying to apply isotope analysis to identify sources of lead, etc., etc. So moving swiftly on, Mont Saint-Jean is the farm behind Wellington's line. So we've moved from Hougoumont to Mont Saint-Jean, which, as I've said, was his field hospital. And here is a lovely drawing from not long after the battle, a painting after the battle by an artist called James Rouse. And you can see there, this is the shattered buildings of Mont Saint-Jean. And you can see there the main road, which leads, these troops are heading north towards Brussels. And you can see wounded and possibly even prisoners in here. You've got dead in the cornfield here, and you've even got evidence of a grave being dug with the shovel here. And I've done quite a lot of work on these artistic representations, and if you'd be interested, there are open access papers by me on the aftermath. But you can see there the building's been hit by cannon. But it's what happened inside the building that's of real interest. And if we use Google Street Map, that's what it looks like today, pretty much as it did. I'm not going to try and go back. Now, hang on a minute. I'm going to go back. My technology has failed me there. I'm going to share again. Excuse me. Elisa and I had great trouble earlier trying to get this to work on screen share, but we're fine. There we go. So moving forward. So you can see that it looks pretty much the same today, but it has been again massively renovated. And the issue here is how much is original and how much is recreation. Well, for one thing, it's an interesting reuse of the building because it's now a brewery, and you can now buy Waterloo beer and Waterloo gin, even better, from this distillery and brewery. And it's owned by a gentleman called Anthony Martin, and it's run by his family. And it's thanks to Anthony that we had permission to actually excavate in what is really his back garden, which is the other side of the front. This is the front that you can see here. So without further ado, so you've been looking from the road across the freeway to that front part of the building. Now, at the time, this was a U-shaped courtyard. It wasn't four walls like Hougoumont and La Haye-Saint. So it wasn't as readily defendable. So it's just as well it was behind the main battle line. It's obviously been added to over recent years. There's been a restaurant added here by Anthony. It's all very peaceful, and it's difficult to imagine the horrors that occurred in the immediate environs. And in fact, some of them are evidenced by the gold star here. So in 2019, we'd moved on from Hougoumont, and our team was working at Mont Saint-Jean. And again, we were in an area of open ground, but covered with trees. This is today an orchard, but we believe at the time of the battle, it was an open field. And you can see there's a track running up here. And if we look, as we will, at the Ferraris map, that track is still there in the late 1700s and was there during the battle. This building here, which was the big building in the street view, is the barn in which many of the operations took place. And we did some research at Glasgow University, and we discovered that at least 20 of the surgeons who served in Wellington's army had actually trained at Glasgow University, which has quite a good reputation for training medics. So what does the gold star represent? Well, we had detectorists working in this area, and we were finding musket shot, and we even found a cannonball, and I don't have time to go into those. But one of them called over an archaeologist, and what we saw in the carefully excavated hole was a bone. Now, metal detectors aren't renowned for detecting bone, but this bone, which was lying on top of a sheet of metal. And so our archaeologists came in and carefully excavated, and very quickly it transpired, well, we could tell almost instantly this was human bone. And what we uncovered were three human legs. These have been amputated by the surgeons in the hospital. And we have a surgeon expert who's probably the world's leading expert on Napoleonic surgery, Mick Crumplin, who tells us that he reckons around 500 limbs were taken off by surgeons in the barn. This was a period when if you were hit in the bone by a musket shot, there was no real option other than to remove the limb. And if you were hit anywhere else on the body other than your arms and legs, the chances are you were going to die. Now, these are operations that are done with saws and knives, with no anesthetic. There are no antibiotics. So if the shot didn't kill you, then the shock of having your leg or arm removed with a saw and the pain and the blood loss might kill you. And if you survived all of that, the septicemia, the blood poisoning caused by a lack of antibiotics might have killed you days or weeks later. It's quite miraculous that anybody survived this sort of amputation, but they did. And we've got 3 examples of limbs that were removed. We can see very clearly the saw marks on them. I'm not going to dwell on those here. Mick Crumplin tells us they are the marks of very good surgeons for the time. And they're lying on a lump of metal, that patch of metal, which I'll come back to. Now, these were removed by our Belgian colleagues and taken to their laboratory in Brussels and examined. And that report is just about to be to come to completion in some respects, I think. But with this leg here, the one on the bottom right, you can see is shattered. We actually found an impacted French musket ball lodged in the lower leg. So that gives you an idea of what the impact of a musket ball is. There was no option there with the shattered bone to actually remove that leg from above the knee. Now, working with veterans, we've got a very good well-being and mental health team with us, some of whom are ex-military psychiatric nurses. And they were very concerned in finding this. At the time, we had a double amputee working with us as part of the team. He'd lost both his legs in Afghanistan. But even though we were prepared for that, when he saw these remains, he actually took a very positive impression from it. His reasoning, he was enjoying metal detecting with basically 2 bionic metal legs, living, enjoying himself. But this brought him back to reality. But his attitude was that he was fortunate to have been injured when he was, i.e. in the modern world rather than in the Napoleonic world, because the pain and the chances of not surviving the operation were quite clear. So almost to my surprise, he came away from this a little bit boosted about his place in the world. So it was an unusual example of how the archaeology can have a positive impact when I actually thought it might have had a negative one. This could have created a flashback, which does happen. So that was really quite fascinating and a very real insight into the realities of the battle. And there you can see another shot. I'm just going to show you this very briefly, this little copper alloy thing here, which has a clip on it. I looked at that more closely, and this is from the top of a scabbard for a bayonet that fits on the end of a musket. But this one's actually not related to a musket. This is from a rifle. And we know that because of its shape. It's actually a flat blade rather than the bayonet that goes on the Brown Bess, which is triangular. And this is what's known as a sword bayonet. And only certain troops, only those armed with rifles, had sword bayonets. So this ties down the nature of this artifact, and possibly, though we can't say because it's just in the same pit close to the bones, possibly the remains of one of these troops, which could have been King's German Legion, or they could have been the 95th Rifles. Which I don't know whether you've seen Sharp on the TV, made very famous, certainly in the UK, by Bernard Cornwell's novels. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, there you have on a reenactor this exact same scabbard, and it's clipped onto his belt here. So it gives you some idea of how we can use artifacts to identify different regiments. The other thing we've got, obviously, are buttons, which have numbers on them, so we can identify the movement of individual regiments on both sides across the battlefield. So in that same trench, and there's the road that we were looking at, our legs are under the tent here, but further up, as we expanded the trench, we came across, at the end of the 2019 season, some animal bones. And here we thought we were looking at the jawbone of a horse. But as is traditional, and Ola will be able to vouch for this, I'm so sure, on archaeological sites, you find something interesting, it's always in the section, and it's always near the end of the dig. And so we didn't have time to deal with it in 2019, but it obviously was of interest to come back to this site when we hoped to come back in 2020. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and COVID hit. So we didn't go in 2020, nor did we go in 2021. And for those of you that don't know, the traffic cone on the Duke of Wellington's head is an icon, a landmark in Glasgow. And every time that cone is taken off his head, somebody on a Friday night after a few beers puts it back on. And it's so famous now, it's actually used by Glasgow Tourist Board as a logo. So we're kind of fond of it. I've even spoken to the current Duke of Wellington about it. I think he's a bit bemused. I don't think he finds it as funny as I do, for obvious reasons. But anyway, I spent the time in the archives and in the library and did a lot of research and published a couple of papers on the aftermath and early tourists, etc. But we did eventually get back in 2022. And here is our good old friend Ferrari's map. And you can see there's the U shape of the courtyard at Mont Saint-Jean. There's the track that's still there today. And that's the kind of trench. Now, when we took time out, I was thinking maybe this is a roadside ditch that has been used basically to dump medical waste in. And we actually have, from the day after the battle, a description by a Scottish soldier of walking into the courtyard and seeing a mound of amputated limbs, arms and legs in the middle of the courtyard. Now, this is obviously cleaned out fairly quickly after the battle. And my idea was that this was a roadside ditch that had been used to dump basically this waste from the interior, which made sense, but we wouldn't know that really until we went back and did more excavation. So this is, again, our target translated into Google Earth. And so in July 2022, we returned, and here we are reopening the trench. So we carefully removed the human limbs and taken them to the lab. Then we put down teram to cover the site and then backfilled it. And here we have our team of archaeologists and veterans cleaning back that trench. There's a lovely view there. Gives you an idea of how close it is. That's the ridge on which the other side of the ridge is that track and the French. La Haye-Saint is just on the ridge behind these trees. And this is the rear slope that most of Wellington's army was on. This is where they're attacked by the cavalry when they're in square. And the first thing we encountered with the bones removed was that lump of metal. And what we discovered was that these were tin boxes. There's a pile of them. And these are actually, this is a reenactor set. These are the tin liners from ammunition pouches. So every soldier would have, those that were using muskets would have a ammunition pouch with their paper cartridges, which have their powder and ball in, not like the cartridges we know today, in this pouch. And they were protected from the wet by these metal boxes inside the leather satchel. And what they've done here is as wounded soldiers arrive, there's no ambulance here. The Wellington's army had no ambulance service. The French did, but Wellington and his allies were pretty basic here. So the wounded would be carried in, and the first thing that the surgeons would do, or their orderlies, would be to take off their straps and their webbing and their tunics to see where the wounds are. And they would dump that material. And I think what's happened here is that these were probably fairly messy inside. They'd be wet, they'd be clogged with powder. And I think what somebody has done, and the archaeology backs this up because we don't have the buckles and things that would relate to it, is that they've pulled out after the battle, when everything is removed, and there's a huge industry in recycling the uniforms, the clothes, the weapons, all the hardware is removed over weeks and months and years after the battle. I think what somebody has done is they've taken out these liners because they're of no use and probably messed up, and they've taken away the bags. And you've got a readily used bag there, and they've ended up dumping during the burial process this bunch of tin liners. And then on top of that, they've dumped amputated limbs. That's my story anyway. And here we have an image by another artist who visited. This is Dighton, who is a British artist and is commissioned by the Prince Regent. He visits about a week after the battle and sees the burial process and makes sketches and makes these drawings. And this is actually Hougoumont, a mass grave that was, according to Dighton, dug outside the South Gate. There's a long story there, but I'm just going to show you. You can see there they've stripped off these ammunition pouches as they dump. And these are bodies. These are probably French bodies from the killing ground. And you'll notice they've all been stripped naked, which the vast majority of bodies were, because everything had a value. Our horse was a horse, and indeed there were 4 of them, lying one in front of the other to the north of our amputated legs, and at least 2 of them had musket shot holes in their skulls, and indeed there is metal inside the head if you pass a metal detector over it. Suffered horrendous wounds, and we have very vivid descriptions from the aftermath of the battle of 3-legged horses wandering across the battle, and soldiers being heartbroken about them. And these, at least 2 of these, look as though they've been led into what certainly by this time is looking like a long trench, possibly not a roadside ditch, possibly a deliberately dug trench, walked into it, injuries to the legs, and they've been put out of their misery. So very unusual. We've got no evidence, as far as I'm aware, from any other Napoleonic battlefield of this. So there's one of them. On the other side of the limbs, so all of the horses were to one side. The other side, in this long trench, we found a human body. And this is interesting and important because it's only the 2nd time that a human corpse, a skeleton, has been excavated by archaeologists on the battlefield. There are very few graves known to have been discovered either deliberately or accidentally at Waterloo, which is unusual given probably around 15,000 men were killed. And why is that? Well, it had perplexed us. We now have an insight into why that is, in part. But here we have an inhumation, and we know this is somebody probably in their early 20s. They have died from blunt force trauma to the head. In that area, they were buried naked. There are no buckles or buttons or evidence of clothing, and you can see deposited nearby. There at least there's a leg bone, a knee and leg. There's a foot and a leg. So we've got more amputated limbs buried near this body. So our obvious question was, are there more bodies in this linear pit? And it was a question we set to answer in 2024, just last September, when we again returned to this site. That's the only other example. This was excavated in 2011 by Dominic Basque, who is my Belgian colleague on the project, one of my Belgian colleagues. And you can see there, the head has gone. It was dug up by a plough. This was excavated in advance of building the car park for a new visitor centre. But you can see there is a French musket ball lodged in the ribs. But this is the only other burial that's ever been excavated on site. But we returned in September of 2024, and we did not find any more human remains. The trench continues, but there's nothing in it. That's down at this end, the far end. But after our 4 horses, which we'd excavated, we found a lot more, and they continue to the north. And by the time we had finished excavation in September of 2024, we had, I think, 15 horses and 1 cow. You can see there again, veterans and archaeologists working on those remains. We also last year found more amputated remains, but importantly, again, on the other side of that pile of tin, there is a separation between human remains, either the body or the amputated limbs, and the horses on the other side. And I think that's very deliberate, but I'm a prehistorian or was a prehistorian. So I'm always looking for what we used to call ritual, but I think we're looking at certainly patterning of burial practice here. But you can see there's some metalwork here. There's a stirrup from a cavalry outfit. You can see there the straight edge of these cuts, incredibly clean, and we've got arms and legs in there. And that is photogrammetry of the remains of our horses from last September. You can see they've been dumped unceremoniously. They're not laid out like the 4 first horses. And we think these were not killed in the trench. These were dragged from the battlefield close by and dumped into the trench. Some of them are only parts of horses, and some of them have been really severely injured and certainly died on the battlefield. An obvious example of that being here. And what we have, this horse's rib cage, is a 6-pound cannonball. Possibly French, would have killed this animal instantly, and probably, if there was anybody on its back at the time, certainly hit them, maybe taken off their leg. But that's been buried with the cannonball still inside it. And next to it, there's another horse's head lying on its haunches. You can see there in its shoulder, there is a musket ball, and once removed, that's it. It's been flattened against the bone. We think it's brown bess. It's distorted, obviously. We've not yet properly looked at it, but we think that's brown bess, which would imply that's a French horse. And we have our horse specialist looking at these remains right now and coming up with some really interesting results. So we've got quite a unique complex here. We've got amputated human limbs. We've got a very rare for Waterloo human body, and horses that have been, look as though they've been put out of their misery, and horse corpses that have been dragged from the battlefield. Nowhere, and I call this a complex because it's so many things. It's not just a burial pit or a disposal pit. And again, nowhere in, we have several battlefields from this period where we've got graves and we've got horses and dead soldiers, but nowhere do we have this combination. So it makes this site quite unique. But why aren't we finding more on the battlefield? Well, here we have to turn to the decades afterwards. And there are accounts of graves at Waterloo in the 1820s being looted and quarried out for the bones, which are then recycled as fertilizer, as bone meal, as phosphate, and shipped to Britain, England and Scotland. We have some records of coming from Napoleonic battlefields and indeed German graveyards. And that would be human and animal bone. It's then ground down in bone mills, and then as a powder, a dust, spread on the fields as fertilizer. And it's known in Scotland to have been very good for the growth of turnips, for instance. We have very few records of that. I think more will come up. We certainly don't have any directly related to Waterloo. We've got some newspaper accounts. I think the battlefield of Leipzig is mentioned. And Waterloo is mentioned, but we don't have any written documentation on this. However, my historian colleagues, Bernard Wilkin, who's an archivist in the Royal Belgian Archives, and German historian Rob Schaefer, encountered in the archives a series of documents relating to the 1830s. And these give clear indication that in the 1830s, the arable crops, the rye, the corn, the wheat, had been replaced by a monoculture of sugar beet. And indeed, I was at Waterloo 2 weeks ago, and there was sugar beet being grown everywhere. And sugar beet, if you process it, if you boil it and filter it, will create the sugar that we know, basically white granulated sugar. And obviously at the time, the only real source was the West Indies and the slave trade, etc. But they discovered they could actually, not using cane, but sugar beet, grow it and process it in Europe. And so Waterloo battlefield becomes a plantation for sugar beet, as does a huge area around it. And it just so happens that the best way to process this is to filter it through charred bone. So not only do you have the product, which is sugar beet, you have the raw material, which is essential for its processing in the form of bone, under the fields where the sugar beet is grown. And the relationship there is obvious. What we get are mass graves, sometimes with hundreds of dead bodies and dead horses in them, being emptied out, the bones being put into furnaces and burnt, the charcoal created, and then the sugar processed. And we have documentation from local courts, from the mayors of the villages, fining farmers for letting this happen on their land. I think even jail time is threatened if illegal removal is permitted on the battlefield at Waterloo. And this is from the 1830s. I have to say that this massive factory that we see here, this refinery, is still standing. It's now a kind of office campus, and the center of it, I'm not going to try and get this back again. The center of it is actually a hotel, and I was staying in there 2 weeks ago. It was really odd feeling. But that's why we are not getting masses of graves at Waterloo. Now, I've published with Bernard and Rob, and the work is amazing, but what we can't assume is that all of the graves have gone. I think that would be a mistake to put that message out. We've got evidence in the ground at Mont Saint-Jean, and we also know now from various other bits of work that we've been doing that I can't talk about yet, that there are other graves on the field at Waterloo. So we should not get the impression that all of the graves were removed and all of the bones was processed, but it certainly gives us an insight into kind of a cultural shift. And this was still current in the 1870s. There were jokes in newspapers in Paris and Berlin about being careful what you stir into your coffee because it might be the atoms of your grandfather. So, you know, really a cultural cringe there, really. But it happened all over Europe. And we know now from other archaeologists working on other Napoleonic battlefields that it's happening there. And they're even starting to find the empty pits that once had bodies in them, but were then removed. And I'm just putting that up to show our main partners in the project, as is my duty. But I really need to credit and thank the wonderful team of people that I've had the pleasure to work with over the last decade, academics, scientists, veterans. They've all been wonderful, and certainly turned this into one of the most amazing projects I've ever worked on. So I've run over slightly there, as I always do, but I will leave that there, and I'll be very happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very exciting talk and presentation. So we have some time for questions. Please ask now.
There's a lot to think about there, I guess.
Yes. Well, I can just have a couple of thoughts. This is a really good example of how archaeology can add, sometimes contradict the historical sources, because you have a lot of the variety of different historical accounts, archives, illustrations, and sometimes you can find something through archaeological methods that is that shows a bit of different picture, different story, and that's, I think, quite interesting. Yes.
Oh, somebody has their hand up there.
Yes. I think. Yes.
May I start? So I would have two questions. One is more general. Second one is more detailed. So first thing, this battlefield from the early 19th century is a huge archaeological site. How do you choose places when you want to make some test trenches excavations? And do you think that it would be possible to try to use any method of random sampling in this regard?
It's a very good question, and there are a number of decisions that are made. One is we look at the history, and if there are questions that we think would be worth trying to answer, we might target that area. But as you say, this is a site that is maybe 3 miles by 3 miles. It's a big area, but we have tried to. I think it's probably the biggest geophysical survey of its type. We had Duncan Williams, who was a Canadian postdoc, spent weeks at Waterloo driving around on a quad bike doing geophysics, and we've got this amazing geophysical survey of quite a big area of the battlefield scattered across it. But there are very basic reasonings for where you choose, where you do. One is, as I said, with the fields to the south of the killing ground, we haven't been able to get access to them because they're always in crop. One of the things that we're finding with global warming is that the crops are coming in earlier and earlier. So we could get there now in July, and some of the crops will be in already, when 10 years ago, those crops weren't coming in until September, October. So climate change is actually giving us access to the ground earlier than previously, and that is not a good thing to say about. That is not. I'm not arguing that's a positive spin-off of the terrible climate crisis we're in, but it can be as simple as that. Some of the landowners, and I know this from working on other battlefields, do not want archaeology done on their land because their fear is that if there is an important archaeological site, they won't be able to do what they want with their land, you build houses or whatever. So we are limited. There is a self-selection in the areas that we can look at. As far as sampling is concerned, and I'm guessing there, we're basically talking about what we would call valuation with sample trenches. We have done that, and it has proved useful. But again, there are limitations. We're only there for 2 weeks, and even though we've got a big team, we've got experts and non-experts. So part of the package is part of the program is educational and training. So what we're not in a position to do is to open large areas on the off chance that there will be archaeology there. So a lot of the work we do is piecemeal and keyhole. So it has to be quite carefully selected. And the geophysics has been really useful there. There will be, I think, an opportunity because of a development near Hougoumont quite soon, which is to do with the renovation of the garden, an opportunity to do a wider area strip and take a look at an area where we have geophysics results. But that's purely because we're assisting with the state, with AWAP, with their mitigation strategies. And as I said, luck can play a big role. Napoleon had a thing about lucky generals, and lucky archaeologists and metal detectorists also play a role. When we found those bones at Mont Saint-Jean, that was a stroke of luck that they happened to find that tin, those bones, because of the tin lying underneath it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I still have a second question. Sure. about your research in Hougoumont. You have shown the results of this metal detector survey, and I'm wondering what's your interpretation of this French musket bullets, which are outside this concentration, which are spread across this open field. Do you think that these bullets were lost, or these are ricochets, or?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think what we're looking at is what's missing in our understanding is the nature of the hedge which separated the forest, the wood, which was a cultivated wood. It was not natural. It was planted, so it was, there were spaces between the trees. But the hedges at the time are very dense, and they lent themselves to fortification. And there's even a description from the defenders of the orchard, just further along from the wall, that they were actually cutting loopholes into the hedge so they could shoot through it. So dense was the hedge. And I think what we're looking at is a mixture of the French breaking through into the open area through holes and gaps in the hedge, and also shooting from the other side of the hedge. And their fire is not going to be accurate. As we know, these muskets are of limited accuracy anyway. So I think what we're looking at in to create that scatter is quite a lot of wildfire. But then when we see these heavy concentrations, there's clearly some order there. Now, the point is, if those barrages that go in, those concentrated musket shots go in against the wall, are they covering attempts to get over the wall? And are we looking at the assaults going into the gaps between where the fire is being delivered? Because obviously you can't run into the area you're shooting at. Or do you rely on the defenders keeping their heads down long enough for you to get into the area they've been shooting at? So there are a lot of we'll never knows here. But given that's an area where we have very few written accounts, and obviously Waterloo has so much written about it, and the archaeology has undoubtedly, I think we can be fairly defensive at times about what archaeology can bring to historical events, and I'm in no doubt now that we can bring quality, value, and further understanding, but it's not all of the answers. It would certainly be easier if the original wall was standing there, because again, the missing element is all the pockmarks on the walls. So we have no idea the damage that wall took. It probably fell over for the first time soon after the battle. Some of the illustrations that don't show the wall itself, but you can just see it in the background, show it heavily damaged and cracked. So that interpretation is open, but there are suggestions as to what did happen. But we've clearly got forensic evidence of the French actually in the garden.
Thank you. Thank you once again for presentation of great research and your thrilling account of the battle.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
There was a question of was a hand from Oleg first. Do you still have a question?
Excellent. In the field. I love it.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes.
Sorry, I think it will be better for all of us to ask from one device. So I will just pass my phone. Thank you for this lecture. It was really interesting, fantastic. Can you tell more about Ukrainian soldiers on your excavation? You told that you have some.
No, we had one. Oh, I'm getting feedback. Could someone
Probably mute.
That's thanks, Ola. We had one Ukrainian veteran, I think in 2019, would it have been? I think it was just pre-COVID, or it could have been just after. And they were on liaison, I think, with the Belgian government, and so they came and he and his family came and spent time on the site, which was pretty amazing for us. We have veterans from the UK, from Holland, from Germany. Funnily enough, not many French participants. We've spent years trying to encourage the French to get involved. We have some French archaeologists. So it was amazing to have somebody from Ukraine involved, and it would certainly be something I think that Waterloo Uncovered would be interested in, because we have this collaboration between our universities, and there is no reason why that couldn't be a conduit for collaboration in that way. So we'll wait and see, but it does appear that engagement. And something I would like to talk to you guys about in a later chat would be, is this something that you are trying? Now, I'm pretty damn sure you will have, by the very nature of what you're going through, you will have veterans on your digs, and I would be interested in having a fuller chat about how that works and what the reactions are and the positive impacts are, and we could maybe exchange notes on that.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ole.
I pass to next.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about the bones of the cow, because if with the horses it's understandable why they're here, but why the cow is there? it's my question. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and I was rather surprised to see it. Either we had a cow or we had a horse with horns on its head, and it was the answer is fairly straightforward. It was butchered. So what we have is the skull and the spine with the rib cage, but some of the ribs have been butchered and the rest of the animal isn't there. And we know that there was probably livestock around the farms. If anybody had any sense, they would have taken them away. But we know that Wellington's army had herds of cattle, so they had food on the hoof, and would butcher them to eat in theatre in the campaign. And we have. I thought these were just myths, but Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish author, visited Waterloo in August of 1815, and he was quite late. Burials had taken place by then, and he wrote a quite terrible poem about Waterloo, which he sold, and the funds raised went to the widows of soldiers killed in Scotland in the battle. But he describes soldiers in Wellington's army using the breastplates, you know, the shiny polished armor that the French cavalry used, the cuirass, which, by the way, became the most treasured trophies after the battle. They were number one item of souveniring that you wanted. And he describes soldiers using those as frying pans, as skillets. So they've got steaks, and they put this over the fire after removing it, presumably from a dead French soldier, and they fry their steaks in those metal bowls as they would become. Now, I thought that was just Walter Scott, poetic license, and I was foolish enough to say so in a paper. But then, not long after, I came across an account by a Scottish soldier who lived not far to the south of Glasgow, where I'm sat now, who describes doing exactly that. But he complains that the bullet holes, the musket ball holes in the armor, leak out all of the gravy and the juices of the steak. So not only does he tell us that the armor was used in that way, he's also telling us that musket balls would pass through that armor. So that's basically it. It's food.
Thank you very much. And for the another trophy question, I'll pass the floor.
Thank you
for the lecture. Yes, I have one question about the trophy weapon, and can we define something about trophy weapon, about the bullet? Because I have a question: if the bullet English or French, can they throw out from the enemy's weapons? Can we define the trophy weapons in the battle? Thank you.
Do you mean using the enemy's weapons, or what? Yeah, that's a good question. The point is that a smaller caliber musket ball, the French musket ball, could be fired from the Brown Bess. Is that the sort of thing you're? Yeah, because it's small, but you would need to do what we call patching, which would be to add extra paper or cloth to seal the space between the musket ball and these are just smooth bore weapons. So you are loading them from the muzzle, pushing them down. So it is possible. What you could not do if you were a French soldier is fire a Brown Bess ball from your Charleville 6.69 musket, because the diameter is too small in the barrel. The issue with the rifles is that they have a very specific type of ammunition, and one of the theories about La Haye Saint falling to the French is that those defending it were mostly riflemen and they ran out of ammunition, and it wasn't as easily available as the Brown Bess ammunition. And there's a story of their ammunition wagon going into a ditch on the retreat, on the advance up to whichever way you want to look at it. If you're French, you would call it a retreat. If you were Wellington, you would call it an advance on the battlefield. So they ran out of ammunition. So we don't have any direct evidence, but what we hope to do with the isotope analysis, which would be with French and Swiss colleagues, would be to identify the regions from which the lead comes from. So we might be able to source the different types of lead. And one of the issues, and I didn't go into this because it's too difficult for just an hour talk, is that there was an earlier battle fought at Waterloo in the 1790s. It's a smaller affair, certainly by the time it gets to Waterloo, but there is a chance of some contamination at Hougoumont between a battle in the 1790s and a battle fought in 1815, which is very inconvenient for us archaeologists. I don't know what they thought they were doing, fighting battles in the same place.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Hello, thank you for a great presentation. I have a question about wounds. What correlation with wounds from bladed weapons and wounds from fire weapons? Thank you.
Very good. If you could turn your mic off. Cheers. Thanks, Ola. So yeah, musket balls are obviously just very basic spheres of lead. There are different ways to make them, different ways to mold them, but that's all you've got. And so if we're going to apply any form of what we might call forensic analysis, we need to advance from that beyond just we have a big ball, so it's Brown Bess. We have a smaller ball, so it's French Charleville. And there has been a lot of work done, and as ever with this sort of stuff, our American colleagues have done a lot of work on this, looking at the deformation of musket balls. And we've done some work ourselves. I mean, we have our own armory of cannon and Brown Bess muskets, but health and safety these days, we don't get to fire it much. But if you look at the distortion on musket balls and compare those to shots that have been fired today experimentally, you can use what Binford called middle range theory to suggest that musket ball has hit that type of target from this range. Probably not in that much depth, but it will give you some indication. So when I'm talking about the garden, what we can tell is because of the distortion levels, those musket balls have been fired at quite close range when they've either hit something, a tree or the ground or whatever. So there is a growing body of information on how we can tell the biography, if you like. And I'm doing work on this at Culloden at the moment. I go back in to dig at Culloden, this 1746 battlefield in Scotland. And what we're going to be doing there is laser scanning of the musket shot and then doing experimental firing to do some very detailed comparative work. But there are, you can if it lodges in a tree stump, it gives a certain amount of deformation. We now know from those two horses and that poor individual's leg that when it hits bone, one of the things a musket ball will do is just flatten, at least by half. So our archaeological examples are now starting to help us further understanding. But we know quite a lot, but there's still a lot of work to be done there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just have just a couple of short questions. One is following what Lilia asked is very uneducated question is whether there were any human remains of women.
That's a very good question and one that needs to be tackled. And the answer is, it looks like it. We haven't found any. But we have, and I think I quote some of these in my papers, we have eyewitness accounts of women lying dead on the battlefield. And we know women were there as camp followers and that, that pejorative term. So there were women in the battlefront. There is a story that the first person to be killed at Waterloo was a pregnant woman standing in a square, hit by a cannonball, but that's whether that's true or not. There is an account of when the dead bodies are being stripped of their equipment and clothing before they're disposed of. And I should say, and I forgot to say this in the talk, that they are not only burying bodies, they are burning them. So there is cremation. And one account says, if the trees had been drier and it hadn't been raining, we'd have burnt a lot more because it was the easiest thing to do. But there is a description of a cuirassier, one of those French cavalrymen, and I use the term man sparingly there, is stripped, and the corpse is a woman. And needless to say, in the account, it's a beautiful woman. But that's, but there is evidence of women being involved, being very closely embedded with the military, providing support. They're probably working in the hospitals. We know that there's almost there's a military cohort in the French army which provides canteen support, which is largely female, and we have accounts of female corpses. There's a female corpse that's been shot, a female that's been shot near Hougoumont, and the interpretation that's in the account is that she was probably robbing one of the bodies off a soldier who was still alive enough to shoot her dead. Now that's their interpretation, but it's a very good question. There are women, and we know this from the 18th and 19th centuries. There are women dressed as men fighting in armies before that was done, and we have suggestions from the field that there were women killed in the battle, some of them even in military uniform. We haven't, needless to say, none of the remains that we've encountered, given there are so few, have been female.
Thank you. And the last question is, what are the plans for the future? What would you like to do next on this side?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one that we're giving a lot of thought to, because we're probably not going to go into the field again until 2027. We need to take stock, and everybody here who's involved in archaeology will know how exciting it is to go on a dig, and perhaps not quite as exciting to write all of that up and do all of the analysis in the lab. Many would disagree, but we have a backlog, and so I've just come back from 4 days of writing. I was put in a basement in the museum on the battlefield with several colleagues, and we were just forced to write 8 hours a day. God knows what we produced. But so we've got a lot of interpretation to do. We've got a lot of experts and various laboratories doing work. As far as the field is concerned, we still have more work to do at Mont Saint-Jean. I do not want to leave that complex, and we know there are more horses to the north. We're pretty satisfied there are no more human bodies, but that is unfinished business, and we can't talk about that feature with full confidence until we've found both ends of it. But there are other sites that we have in mind. At least one of them is to check out a recent account of a possible mass grave surviving. So that, in the first instance, that might even happen within the next few months. And our intention here is not just to look for graves. For years I was determined our mission was not looking for graves, which is the question everybody asks, but because of the complexities of the aftermath of the battle, and we now know the industrial processes, we can't ignore the issue of graves. And so I am eager to prove and demonstrate that there are more graves on the battlefield, and therefore it remains an important site. It would do anyway, but you know what people are like. A developer would be delighted to know that there are no human remains to worry about at Waterloo, though the state's not going to, So there is a friction there that archaeology can play a part in. But I'm actually taking a little bit of a back seat. I will probably visit during the excavations, but I can no longer do 2 weeks with 150 people. It's just I'm done on that one. So, but I will go along and I will offer advice and visit. But I'm very keen to see the continued use of veterans in other, and I would certainly be very interested in what you might plan in the immediate future or after the war or whatever, because I think what we're doing at Waterloo could be very important for the way you operate. A few lessons anyway. I mean, we have not had the same experience by any measure, but we have seen how it can be positive.
Thank you. I'm sure we will return to this question, to this talk later. Thank you.
Right.
And I guess that's all questions, and we're really a little bit out of the time, but it's
Not bad.
It was a good time. Thank you once again for the wonderful lecture. It was very enjoyable.